Termo to Madeline, audio edition, page 107, chapter titled Termo, the Arrival of the NC&O. Now, for the past 20 years before 1900, there had been a little narrow-gauge railroad inching its way out of Reno, Nevada. Speculation was rife as to where it was going or what purpose it intended to serve. It seemed that even its direction and financial backers did not know what they had in mind. From the time the work was commenced on the roadbed out of Reno in December of 1880, the company had undergone 5 name changes, including the Nevada and Oregon, or N&O, and the Nevada and California, N&C. Finally setting on Nevada, California, and Oregon, NCO. Bickering was constant among the backers of the project. One squabble among the stockholders, directors, and workers had left the company secretary dead and an important stockholder wounded in a wild shootout that took place on September 27, 1881, in Reno. It seemed that the sale by court order of the N&O to the Moran Brothers, a New York banking firm, in 1884 would put the railroad in motion. That is what it did. Over the next 6 years, the rails were laid another 50 miles. Prior to that time, the railroad had sat just across the Nevada state line in California, 30 miles from Reno. So, in 1890, a new railhead of Amity, named for Amity Moran, was established 80 miles from Reno. The new terminus was just below Hot Springs on the east side of Honey Lake. This had brought an abundance of heated complaints from Susanville people who had wanted railroad service to the town. Its builders had felt that if the railroad ran into Susanville, there was no suitable route out, however. The Easterners felt that Susanville was a no place anyway, causing some deep-seated hatred among the local residents. One can only imagine the chagrin of the Susanville populace when 10 years later the railhead was built in Termo, a real no place. There had been absolutely nothing there previously, and the town of Termo sprang up solely because the new terminus of the NCO being up at the spot on June 1st, 1900. Really, it was nothing new for the little railway. That is how Amity came into being, too. Over the nearly 10 years that the NCO terminus was at Amity, rumors continued to circulate as to where the railroad was going. Alturas, Lakeview, and Paisley were hoping it was coming their way. They were fairly confident it would, but no one knew just how soon or what route it would take. A reporter at the Lassen Advocate had a pretty good idea of what to expect when on July 2nd, 1891, he wrote, after complaining that there was no roadhouse at Amity, quote, "The engine and cars had to stand outdoors at night, like the pack mules at the post, and this, as much as any one thing, leads us to the conclusion that some time the road will be expected to Madeline Plains, to the point 125 miles from Reno, where a stable for the iron horse will undoubtedly be built." Unquote. He was not far off when 9 years later the new terminus sat 130 miles out of Reno. Slowly, over the next several years, a construction seemed to be completely stalled. People began to forget about the railroad's northward expansion. In March of 1898, word leaked out that plans were being made to extend the line to Van Loan's. Elmer Van Loan had been operating the Amity to Alturas stage line for several years. His stage and freight station on the northwest corner of the plains was well known by everyone familiar with the area. It was only logic to the residents of the northeast California and southern Oregon that Van Loan's would be the next terminus in the NCO's northward push. Work was begun on this northern extension in January of 1899. A force of 50 men were employed in clearing and building the roadbed out past Hot Springs. 3,000 tons of steel rails were purchased and shipped to the site. Only then did people really begin to believe that the railroad was moving ahead. Speculation ran rampant about where the construction would actually stop. Few people expected it to reach Alturas during the construction effort. Some did not expect it to get past Hot Springs, 5 miles out of Amity. No one expected it to stop in Termo. A hotel was built at Secret Valley in anticipation of big money to be made at the end of the line. But the NCO did not even go into Secret Valley. Instead, it went around the west side of Mud Flat and on up Snowstorm Canyon. At the time, a hotel was built at what would be called Carlo. The railroad ran through there but did not stop, leaving the expected terminus as high and dry as no one in Secret Valley. Finally, by February 1900, the roadbed was completed and rails laid to a point everyone called Juniper Ridge. Although the actual site of the construction was 5 miles due west of Juniper Ridge proper, it was the closest point to reference at the time. The railroad had already left the Rufus Hansen place some 6 miles behind, and the Van Loan station was yet another 10 miles to the north. By March 1st, a well was dug and a 4,000-gallon water tank was in place. Slowly, as people saw buildings begin to grow up, they began to realize that the railroad was going no farther. Already, NCO officials were calling the new terminus Termo. It had something to do with somebody in the office in Reno linking the words that end in O. Well, who knows? Maybe it is better that a word ending in Enos. Anyway, settlers on the Madeline Plains were just plain excited that they would soon have a railroad depot within a few hours of their home. Everyone else was aghast at the thought that the otherwise sane promoters of the NCO were even contemplating ending the railroad at such a place for even a short time. Controversy sprang up immediately and were to last until the rails moved on. In spite of disagreements and bad publicity, the town of Termo came rumbling into being. The first town on the Madeline Plains. A commodus of 178 by 48-foot warehouse was constructed on solid rock foundation. It had a cement floor with rails on the road entering the south end. Inside was a turntable, and the building acted not only as a warehouse, but as a roundhouse as well while the railhead was at Termo. By May 1900, a depot had been built, as well as an eating house and some livery barns. Eventually, a wood-frame hotel was constructed, and a roomy brick structure was in the plans. On June 1st, the entire new extension from Amity was placed in operation. Trains left Reno at 9 o'clock in the morning and arrived in Termo at 6:20 a.m. and arrived in Reno at 4:30 p.m. Elmer Van Loan's new Termo to Alturas stage met passengers at the railhead in the evening and carried them on to Van Loan's stage station, this before the hotel was completed. The following morning the passengers would be treated to a jouncing, fast-paced ride up to Alturas. Once the hotel was complete, the stage would pick passengers up there the following morning after the train arrived. Within a year, the NCO had arranged for special rates for anyone leaving the east who desired to settle at or otherwise ride to any of the 4 points on the main line: Plumas, the junction with the Sierra Valley Railroad; Hot Springs, known as Wendell; Armstrong, otherwise known as Snowstorm or Termo. The Chicago to Termo trip would be had for $34. One could travel from New Orleans, Memphis, or St. Louis to Termo for $31.50. And it cost $29 to get to Termo from any of the Missouri River points. In spite of the success involved, controversy continued to rage over Termo. In October, T.F. Dunaway, the new CO vice president and general manager, made his first trip to Termo. In the party with him was a Reno Gazette reporter who had the following remarks to make about the new town. Quote, "The party was at last landed on the west end of the dusty adobe Madeline Plains, and in a section where water has to be hauled for 18 miles, and not a shrub or blade of grass to be seen. Nothing but dust, low sagebrush, a few tents, a small eating house, 3 well-planned barns, 3 neatly completed cottages, and an immense, great big, substantially built warehouse, setting on a solid stone foundation with a heavy corrugated iron roof. A $10,000 monument of folly in the desert filled the overflow with freight, a cement and a railroad steer rail floor, covered with all kinds of awning teams to transport it to the country as far north as Lakeview, Oregon. The stages of van loans leaving there daily after the arrival of the trains for all the northern points. Mrs. M.A. Mapes is proprietress of the eating house and served the party with a good dinner, and at 2 o'clock Mr. Smith gave the alarm, and we were on our way back." Unquote. The Madeliners were increasingly incensed by such derogatory remarks. On February 18, 1901, the Madeline correspondent with the Lassen Advocate had the following rebuttal for an article published in the Reno Journal. Quote, "The Reno Journal is credited with saying that Termo, on the bleak Madeline Plains, was frizz up, and if there was a drop of water within 10 miles of here, it had probably turned to ice. Although that the thermometer fell to 22 degrees below zero on Saturday night, and 24 degrees on Sunday night, and there were 2 feet of snow on the level and badly drifted. Hardly, if there was, at any time, been 2 feet of snow on the level. Our stockmen have failed to note the fact. A loaded 4-horse freight team on wheels left Termo during the deepest snow and continued on into Modoc without any delay. Within 10 miles of Termo on Saturday and Sunday nights, February 9th and 10th, the 2 coldest nights, the thermometer registered 12 degrees below zero. Quite a difference. And if there is any difference in altitude, it is in favor of Termo. There is a deep well of good water on Mr. Brockman's ranch, known as the Parks Place, situated 2 miles from Termo, that is quite impossible for the cold to touch. Perhaps Termo is frizz up, but Madeline is not such a bleak desert as the journal would have it appear." Unquote. Now the reader will be left to his own conclusions as to whether Termo is a misplaced portion of Siberia or the most beautiful spot on the nation. The point is that regardless of all the bickering among the correspondents and reporters of the various newspapers, local stockmen, freighters, stage drivers, and travelers, where, no matter where they were coming from or going to, they did not have as far to go in the open. In a saddle or hard, uncompromising wagon seat, everything was moving in and out of Termo by the fall of 1900. The NCO had bought 2 new oil-burning locomotives the year before. With these added to their fleet of wood-burners, the railroad was doing its part to keep up a steady flow. Jerk-line freighters were busy keeping up with their end of the progress, too. Termo, after being long-line team, left Termo daily hauling merchandise and machinery out to the north. An equal number of horses, men, and freight wagons were coming in each day, bringing in flour, grain, and wool to be shipped out. Beef animals were being driven in at a regular rate to be shipped out to the lower country. And cavalry horses were still in demand, several bunches of them being loaded at Termo that fall. Immigrants passed through Termo in a steady stream going both directions. Reno, the big city on the corner end of the line, may have been disappointed in Termo, but then, who was asking them anyway? Anyone who had a reason to be in Termo could not have cared less what Reno thought. Next chapter, titled Elmer Van Loan's Fast Stage Lines, page 121.